I'm Elizabeth Arruda, member of the Pacifica Historical Society and host of this week's Footprints of Pacifica. Each week we get together and we explore a little bit more about Pacifica's history, its character, its characters, and this evening I am so glad to be able to introduce to you Kay Kirkland. Kay Kirkland has been a teacher in Pacifica for over 30 years, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about her experiences teaching, not only in Pacifica, but also her first teaching experience, which was at a Japanese-American internment camp during World War II. Thank you so much, Kay, for being on the show.
My pleasure.
So, Mrs. Kirkland, tell us a little bit about where you were born.
I was born in San Francisco. My father was born in San Francisco. My mother and her parents were all born in California, Northern California. So we're native Californians way back.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to school?
We lived in the Sunset District in San Francisco. And I went to Columbus Elementary School, Laguna Honda Elementary School, almost said Laguna Salada, and Polytechnic High School, and then San Francisco State College.
So to talk a little bit about your first teaching experience, we need to go to the time period during World War II, and right around the time of when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Could you tell us a little bit about when and where, excuse me, what your thoughts were when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
It was bombed on a Sunday morning, and I had gone to church. When I got home, my mother told me that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was then, but when I found out about it and all that had happened with it, then I was a little concerned and frightened about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And shortly afterward, after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, in which he authorized the Secretary of War to remove and intern anyone deemed a threat, right, from the West Coast to be put in internment centers. And I'm really curious, but what were people feeling at this time? Like, what were your feelings? What were your thoughts?
Well, the bombing was frightening because the Japanese had emissaries in Washington, D.C., working with government officials. Mm-hmm. So they had betrayed our trust in them, and so that was frightening. And so we just felt, well, you can't trust the Japanese, and so it included then all of these people who had nothing to do with it, innocent people, American citizens, mm-hmm. educated people, farmers, and so forth. It was just kind of a frightening thing, and I think that most of us thought it was the thing to do, was to put them where they couldn't make contact with the Japanese.
Mm-hmm. I also understand that your background, your ancestry is German, and
yeah.
you're German American. So how did that play into World War II and your experiences at the time? And I understand you had some letters come to your family. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
A lot of people were trying to get out of Germany at that time, and so we received letters that these people had the same last name as my father, and so they received letters during the whole war period from people asking help. I think my father didn't help any of them. They couldn't afford to. Mm-hmm. My uncle sent things to Germany, and he found a family that was related to us, and so he sent clothing as well as money and things to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your first teaching job, and how did you find the position at Tule Lake?
Through the placement service at San Francisco State.
Great. So, Tule Lake was one of 10 internment centers in the country, and I'm kind of curious about how your parents felt about you leaving home and going off to this internment center.
Well, I think they knew that when I got a job, it might not be close to home, mm-hmm. and so they were prepared for that. It just so happened that my mother's brother had a big grocery store in Tule Lake, so they felt better about that there'd be some family there that could look after me.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the conditions of your employment. How much were you paid? What were some of the conditions at the camp?
Elementary teachers were paid, and I'm not quite sure on this amount. Time has taken its toll. Elementary teachers received $1,350 a year, which was above the state minimum at that time. The high school teachers received $1,440 a year. So I guess high school teachers always have made more money than elementary teachers.
And on top of that, of the pay, am I right in understanding that most likely the food and housing was sort of included in that position?
Yes, I don't recall that we paid anything for that.
So what year was this that you were at Tule Lake? When were you there?
We arrived in end of August 1942, and I left about May 1943.
So that was in the very beginning of the internment center. And maybe you could help us to understand too where you were in the camp. Like, were you living inside the camp? Were you outside the camp? Where were the administration and teachers living?
We were outside the camp, just outside the fence, the posted area.
I was hoping we could talk a little bit about what the conditions were at the camp as well. And I have here a map to sort of help us think about its location right on the Oregon-California border.
Okay.
What do you remember about the conditions at Tule Lake?
Well, Tule Lake is a dry lake bed. Silty soil, salty soil, dry. It's also associated with the Modoc Indian Wars, which were in the around 1885, and there is a high up, because it was a lake at that time, where there are Indian writings and pictures on the walls there. The United States won the Modoc Indian Wars, but with some loss of life. Anyhow, back to the camp. It was, as I said, a dry lake bed, dry situation, wet in the wintertime, hot in the summertime. Not a very agreeable place.
Well, I have a picture here of the conditions during the winter time. When you're describing it being a dry lake bed, it looks a little wet during the winter, from what I can tell.
We had to walk from where we were staying to the school each day. Some of the teachers had cars and they could drive and maybe take somebody with them, but we didn't always get to do that. Some days we sloshed our way over to school.
So tell us a little bit more about the about your living conditions. Were you in what kind of housing were you in?
The teachers, they were not ready for us. Camp had opened not very far before that, and there were long barrack buildings. They had built enough space for a large number of soldiers and said there was only a company of soldiers there. So they put up a barbed wire fence between the barracks where the teachers were to live and where the soldiers lived. We were in the barrack buildings, but they had no separations, and so they gave us large cabinets that for storage, but they also served as walls. Gave us a little bit of privacy. The bathrooms were at the ends of the buildings. We ate with the soldiers for the first week or 10 days that we were there, until they got civilian quarters ready for the teachers. But the barbed wire fence didn't last very long, because there were a lot of young teachers there, and all of these soldiers from Texas were there, and so holes were cut in the fence, and we could go back and forth that way, in addition to going around the long way.
Love finds a way.
Yeah. So then after about a week or 10 days, then they were ready for us at the civilian place, and we ate there, and eventually moved into different quarters. But it was interesting.
Absolutely. So I know that you were teaching the 3rd grade class, and how many schools were there to your knowledge at the camp?
I think 8 or 9, I'm not sure.
Tell us a little bit more about what it was like. What were the classrooms like? What were the conditions for you as a teacher?
Well, the classrooms were empty. We had no desks, we had no chairs, no books, no paper, no pencils, no play equipment. As time went on, the carpenters had built desks, and the carpentry shop, which was manned by Japanese Americans, built desks for us and built chairs. School districts around in the area there supplied us with books that they no longer used, and so we eventually had books. For lack of blackboards, we had large sheets of paper that we could use for blackboard. The play area, the kids had marbles, and they played marbles all the time right outside the windows. How much English they knew, I'm not sure about some of those children, but they knew a lot of the swear words, and they didn't miss many of those, and they'd be outside playing, and the air would be blue with these kids swearing. And these are little kids, so, and their hands were rough, they were chapped and open, and it really hurt me to look at their hands from the playing, but that was about all they had to play with.
I imagine some of the conditions of their hands as well would be about the salt from the dry lake bed,
I'm sure
right?
that
and
had something to do with it.
Just the difficult living conditions at the camps.
Yeah.
I have a picture. This is not from Tule Lake like the others, but this one is from Manzanar. Some Dorothea Lange photographs that weren't published before, and they showed a little bit of like the conditions in which you were teaching without desks or chairs, and yeah. I just imagine that to be an extremely difficult teaching situation.
It was, and this obviously then, because this is put together so hurriedly, is one of the reasons they weren't supplied with things. It just took time to get them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how many students would be in the classroom at a time?
I don't remember, 30, 35.
And what kind of technology did you have to use?
Nothing.
How about for making copies?
We had, and all the teachers, this wasn't just at the camps, this was wherever you taught. We didn't have copy machines. We had cookie sheets, and they had a gelatin mixture in them. And if you wanted to make copies, you had to kind of moisten it a little bit. The copy, the master copy, was on a piece of paper that you wrote on with either a pen or a pencil that was a purple ink. And then you smeared it on your gelatin pad, waited, I've forgotten how long you had to wait. Then you took that off, and then to make copies, then you took a paper, one piece at a time, spread it over the gelatin pad, took it off, set it aside so it would dry, had another piece of paper, and you fixed this one the same way, and so you'd have your papers out there one at a time drying. So you could make as many copies as you wanted, or until they were so faint you couldn't read them. If you had another paper, something else you wanted to copy, then you had to have another tray. And it took about 2 days for the ink to disperse enough that you could make clear copies again. Wow.
I'm exhausted just listening to that. So tell us a little bit more about the students in your classroom. What kind of backgrounds were they from, and what were some of the challenges that you faced teaching?
Well, they took the children from all over. The people were from all walks of life. Farmers, immigrant farmers who didn't speak English, a little raw perhaps in their way they did things, to culture. There were doctors there, there were dentists there, there were professional people from all walks. It was just a mixture, and then they were all dumped in there together. Not even with private bathrooms. The bathrooms didn't even have curtains, doors. They were just lined up with no doors, nothing. Just sometimes for the teachers and where the schools where we were, they had like a shower curtain across the doors of the lavatories that we could use. But for the people themselves, it was a cruise situation. I was never in the quarters where any of them lived. So I don't know what their situation was.
I understand that in your classroom there would sometimes be a Japanese American teacher's helper. What was your relationship to these teacher's helpers? What kinds of roles did they play in the classroom, and what do you remember about that relationship?
Yeah, well, it varied, I think, from class to class. Some of them were teachers, some with college education, some with just high school education. But they assisted in classrooms like teachers' aides do today. Maybe not with training, but they did that. And of course, we really needed them to begin with because we had so many children and not very much to work with.
I'm assuming that some of them perhaps translated as well for you at times?
They could. I don't recall using one for that, but they could.
I also understand that at other camps and from other stories that I've read, that at times people who lived outside the camp were able to bring things in for folks inside the camp, things that they needed, whether it was a sweater or you know, things that they didn't have. Yeah. Do you remember anything?
Yeah, we did. I know that we did that some, not very much in my case, but that we could bring them things that they must have checked it. I'm sure. I don't remember that we did, but they must have checked it, like security, but not like security today at the airports.
Well, the reason I ask is because I think some of those stories about folks and of you and other teachers as well of bringing things back for the internees who obviously are imprisoned, they can't leave and get things. That's really a really beautiful moment of kindness in this story. Could you tell us a little bit about why you left the internment center?
I met my husband there. He was one of the soldiers. And there were 5 of the teachers who had done the same thing that year. We'd all gotten married. In February, and we were married in February, and when we got back to camp that weekend after we were married, they were having protesting. So all of the soldiers were confined to their areas. I don't remember that we were confined, but I don't understand. Anyhow, they were confined to quarters and they tried to contain the protesters. So right after that, an order was issued that the wives of servicemen, soldiers stationed there, could not live nor work in the camp. I guess they were concerned for our safety. So anyhow, this order was issued in February. Well, the lieutenant who was in charge of the soldiers and in charge of the camp didn't do anything about it. And they finally reminded him that he had to tend to it. So that he got around to that in May. He was a really nice person. He was friendly with all of us. Took us out to dinner the day we were married. And so then we had to move. So I moved into an apartment in town, and because my husband continued to be stationed there.
And from my reading and understanding, that's right around the time in which Tule Lake had a sort of a major shift, right? After you were married and after you moved out of the camp in the fall of 1943 was the time in which the U.S. government decided that Tule Lake was going to be the center for the so-called disloyals, for the so-called troublemakers, for anyone in any of the other camps who would protest or who would, decry their conditions, that they were all sent to Tule Lake. So it sounds like you left right at the time when Tule Lake sort of shifted.
Yeah.
Do you recall any stories that you heard or anything from that time period? Yeah, I know you were outside the camp. But
yeah, I was out, and I don't remember hearing anything about that. I got a job teaching in the town of Tule Lake, and we, the men could go back and forth, but they were still stationed there.
Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the other camps that you worked at and what your positions were?
You mean when my husband was transferred? We went from there. Tule Lake is up in the northeastern part of California in Modoc County. He was sent from there over to Camp White, Oregon, and which is near Medford. And I got a job there working. It was an ordnance command shop, they called it. repairing vehicles and tending to that sort of thing, and so I did clerical work for them. From there, my husband was sent to Arizona and someplace else, and finally, he went to Fort Leonard, Missouri, and then he went to Camp House in Texas, which is near Gainesville, and that was a German POW camp, so I did clerical work there, keeping track of the records. In that area, there were a lot of German immigrants, or the children of German immigrants. So some of the POWs were related to people who were working there, and they worked out in the farms there in Camp House. And they received gift packages from their German Red Cross, or the equivalent. So they were treated well. A neighbor of a relative of mine in Germany, the neighbor was in a POW camp in Texas, and they gave him classes. So he took a class in English, so he said he learned his English had a Southern accent. And I couldn't tell that it was Southern, but he definitely had an accent.
Oh, wow. So long after the war had ended, in the 1980s, there was a presidential commission established to really investigate Japanese-American internment and to sort of come up with their findings. And I want to read a little bit of what their conclusion was to you and see what your reaction is to it. Okay. So the federally appointed commission met the conclusion that the internment of Japanese Americans was based upon race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And then President Ronald Reagan in 1988 signed the Civil Liberties Act, which was an apology to the people of Japanese ancestry who had been interned during the war. What are your feelings about this?
Well, I think it was long overdue. I think they made a big mistake in that, but at the time, it seemed the right thing to do was to remove them so that they could not make contact with the Japanese government, which was, of course, proven unnecessary. But people were scared. We had every right to be scared. But as I say, I think it was long overdue. They should have apologized and done something, made remuneration of some kind for those people.
So I wanted to shift topic a little bit and talk about your experience in Pacifica as a teacher. Could you tell us a little bit more about when you moved here and your first teaching experiences here?
We moved here in October 1950. There was no Lindemar, there was no Westview, there was no Fairway Park. It was a two-lane highway. We had a fairly good-sized grocery store, and Sharp Park was Landy's Market. No theater, no big market. These things came along later. And I started teaching here in September of 1952. And we had, I was teaching in this, what's now the City Hall. We were upstairs. I had a third grade. Mildred Bachman had a fourth grade across the hall from me. And the teachers in the basement, Lillian Hansen and Inga Probst, and they had primary. There were classrooms inside the Little Brown Church. They had made classrooms there, but those weren't used when I was teaching. Pacific Manor School was completed in the summer of 1952, and so they were using that. But we had classrooms in the Quonset hut. There was a school in Rockaway Beach that housed some of the children too. And so as they went along, we got up to 15 schools at the height of all of the influx of the baby boomers and so forth. At Lindemar School was late opening in 1956. It wasn't finished. And so we did piggybacking. And I was at Sharp Park. And in this photo, if you can see this is my class here. Art Newman had the other 8th grade at Sharp Park School. But we had an 8th grade class from Lindemar. And it was split up into two groups. This is Bob. He was the teacher from Lindemar, and these children were his class in with mine, and these children were his also in with Mr. Newman's class. Some of you might recognize this gentleman here. He used to be the Pacifica, he was our Pacifica police chief for a while, Charlie English.
And you're right over here. I don't think you pointed yourself out, but
yeah.
I can show you in this one too. Great.
Okay, this is just another picture. I don't know if I said this, that Bob spent half of his time in my classroom and half in the other classroom. So that it relieved the load some when, you know, that was a lot of kids to have a class and a half in one classroom.
So it's really reflected the baby boom and the surge in population to have these piggyback classrooms and this change in population of Pacifica as well.
Yeah, because they started building Lindemar is what happened,
I see.
among other things.
I see.
Actually, Pacific Manor was one of those classes that was built too. After, well, it was built when we moved here, but it increased the school population.
And I understand that these photographs are actually from Life magazine, and that in 1956, you can see Mrs. Kirkland on the cover, on the school and the piggyback on the cover of Life magazine, and these images are from that, which is really something special.
Yeah, I saved the pictures for a long time, and then I gave them to the school district.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I wanted to just give a warm thank you to Mrs. Kay Kirkland for meeting with us tonight. And I wanted to tell folks about the Pacifica Historical Society and to tell them to go online to www.pacificahistory.org. And I want to thank you so much for this show and for watching the show.